Hi, my name is David Worthington. In this video, you are going to see how to load test Dynamics NAV using Visual Studio. This is the first video in a series of videos about load testing Dynamics NAV. What you see here is the load test run report. By following the steps in this demonstration, you will be able to perform a load test on your own NAV instance and produce a detailed load test report like this. You will learn how the sample load test solution works and how to analyze the load test results. To follow the steps in this demonstration, you need to have some prerequisites installed on your machine. Firstly, you need to have Visual Studio Ultimate in order to be able to create and run load tests. The test methods we use can be developed using other versions of Visual Studio, but you will need the Ultimate version to create and run load tests. Secondly, you need to have NAV 2015 installed with the demonstration company. The sample load test solution is designed to work with the demonstration application. You need to have the web client installed, and in this demo, the web client is using Windows authentication, but the tests can be configured to use NAV user password authentication. Finally, you need a NAV license that allows multiple concurrent users. You cannot run load tests with a demo license. Here are the steps I'm going to walk through to get a load test running against NAV. Firstly, we'll download and build the NAV load test solution. Secondly, we will run the order processor load test scenarios. And finally, we will analyze the results of the load test run. I will explain the components of the load test solution as we go through these steps. So the first step is to download or clone the NAV load test solution. The solution is available on GitHub, and if you haven't used GitHub before, don't worry, it's very easy to use with Visual Studio. I'll show you. So here is the GitHub homepage for the NAV load test, very easy to find. And here we have the main solution, which is for NAV 2015. We have also created another branch for the NAV 2013 R2 load tests, which are slightly different. But to start with today, we're using 2015, so we will clone the master branch here, and there's just a button here you click to copy the clone URL. We copy that, we switch to Visual Studio, and we say connect to team projects, and then clone. And here we enter the URL, and it clones the solution for you. So once you click clone, it will download and create the solution. If we select the solution here and open it, the solution consists of 3 projects. So if we go and build the solution, it'll build all the projects. The 3 projects are the load test project, the test utilities project, which contains utility classes for the tests, and finally the user session library, which contains all the classes for calling the NAV client service that we are using. So before we go any further, let's just check if we've got that service set up. So if we look in the application config file, you can see here there is a URL to the NAV client service. So to make sure that's set up correctly on your machine, you can just click here on the URL and it will open the page for that service. And this just shows us that the web client is installed correctly and the service is running. So we can see in the test solution we have tests here, and if we open the Test Explorer window, it can see all the tests. So now we'll click Run All to make sure all the tests run before we try to execute them as part of a load test. And while we're doing that, we'll have a look at what's in the solution. These are the main components of the load test solution. A load test consists of tests, scenarios, counter sets, and run settings. The tests define what actions you want to simulate during the load test. A scenario is used to model how a group of users interact with an application during the load test. And counter sets, which are organized by technology, are useful for when you want to analyze performance counter data and other metrics from your system. There are some standard counter sets that come with Visual Studio, and you can also add NAV performance counters. So if we look here in our solution, you can see we have the load test file here. order processor load test. And here are the scenarios, in this case order processor. Here are the counter sets, and you can see the standard counter sets and the NAV counter sets I've added, which contain all the Dynamics NAV and SQL counters you may be interested in. And finally, the run settings down here. The run settings are a set of properties that influence how long the load test runs for. So if you look at the properties window here, you can see I've set the run duration here, for the purposes of this demonstration, to 5 minutes, but you can decide how long you want to run your test for. So they're the components of the load test. Let's have a look into what makes up the load test components. So the tests are test methods. If we have a look in the solution here, we can see if we open one of the tests, create and post sales order, we can see that it's a test method in Visual Studio. So a test method describes a task, and examples of tasks are things like opening a list page, selecting a record, opening a card page, creating a document, entering data, posting a document, all these scenarios. And the test consists of one or more actions. So that can be something like opening a page, clicking a button, entering data, responding to a dialogue. The response time for the test is measured in Visual Studio and is the time to execute the complete test. The transactions, however, are the individual steps. So we measure the begin and end for each individual step. And these response times are most likely to be the ones you're interested in to measure how responsive your application is. So if we quickly look into NAV here, we can see that this is the complete test scenario here, and each individual step is being measured along the way as a transaction. So the test scenario consists of a load pattern, a test mix, and a network mix. So if we look at the scenario definition here in the load test, we can see we have the order process scenario has a test mix, a network mix, and a load pattern. The test mix describes what tests will be executed by each virtual user and how often the users will perform the task. So we can see here the various tests have been set to a different rate per user per hour. The load pattern describes how many users will run the test and how the users will be progressively added to the test. You can see here we start with 1 user and we increase to 10 users with a step every 5 seconds of adding 1 user. Finally, the network mix can be used to simulate users on different types of networks. Here we're just using all LAN for this demonstration. The next step is to run the load test. And the steps are to open the order processor load test file, which we've just looked at, and then to click Run Load Test. So here we can see the file is open, and if we check before, we ran our tests in Test Explorer and they've all run individually. So now we just click on Run Load Test, and the load test begins, and the load test analyzer window appears. While the load test is running, we can look at the features of the load test analyzer. The load test analyzer has a graphs view, which also shows test response time, and a tables view. So let's look at the analyzer view. So you can see in the graphs view it's showing various metrics from the test, and those are coming from the counters which I mentioned before here. So for example, if I want to show a particular NAV performance counter, for example active sessions, I can simply drag it over to the graphs view for system under test. And here we can see that the active sessions is increasing as the load test, the user load of the test increases. And we could say they're now up to 10 users, and active sessions here is also showing 10 active users. If we switch over to the sessions window in NAV now and refresh, we can actually see now we have one session, which is my Windows client session I'm looking at, and all the test sessions here. These are the sessions created by the load test. If we look at the test response times, we can now see the tests are beginning to execute, and they're shown in this window and below here in a table. So you can see the average times for each test, which are shown in seconds. So here we can see the lookup random customer test is taking an average of 1.2 seconds. The results are not yet aggregated for the whole test, so they're showing the results up until now. So let's have a look at the tables view, which is here. and we can